we did talk about the game a lot. Do you want to go first? Or? Okay,
yes.
come.
Yes. Okay. Well, we talked about a lot of things, but one of the questions here was, the qualities of the games in terms of in terms of empathy. So we discussed that, and we wrote at least 4 things down here that we could agree on. And one of what the game does, it makes the children or the parent recognize things. Recognize something that they couldn't recognize otherwise if they haven't seen this row of cards. For instance, the confirmation card. The father could recognize that it's embarrassing for the child that he has to show up in church in a little village where the child actually wants to be have hidden his identity, not being a Hells Angels child. So the card could make him recognize that it's embarrassing.
It was really interesting for me playing the game because I thought, oh God, why would you want to play this game? It's like really dark. But when we played it, it was fun. And that but because actually it was like a bit like going fast, collecting the colours, like getting a.
Lorraine was cheating all the time.
Thank you. No, I ended up with less cards. But what Eva just said, we thought could happen if you played it with the child and the father, or if you played it just the inmates together, that it had the qualities were about cognitive empathy, that it made you recognise things, it made you recognise information, but whether you felt anything, we felt had to happen when you were playing with somebody else, like the affect, and that Thomas came up with this phrase.
Yeah, we were discussing the difference between an empathy thing and a tool. And so I think we arrived at the idea that the empathy thing is a design that is able to calibrate tensions, agonistic relationships. In this case, not only between the child and the father, but also between the inputs we got from the family therapist and the prison officers. So it's a social assembly of meeting points that the game, if it's successful, recognizes and respects that tension instead of doing away with it.
So we said it was an empathy thing because if you played it, you'd get the information that you might not want to know, but you would get. You wouldn't be able to not get it. But for affect, for empathy, for it to be an affective tool, that interaction between two people would have to happen, and that you would have to feel it. It would be mediative, and we weren't completely sure, but it seemed the physical presence and interaction seemed to be part of the qualities of the empathy thing.
Yes, yes.
Good. That's all we got to. Sorry,
yes.
because we got off. So I hope those 4 points were helpful.
Should we explain these?
Got it.
The third one, I guess, is the one that we talked about. That actually the fact that we are talking with these children about these difficult issues, and that they are being heard, you could say, or being seen, or that's also a empathy thing. But that's between us as as designers or as researchers and the people we are designing for. You could say that's also an empathy thing.
Yeah, I thought that was a blinding way of, if you were working with inmates, to actually get them to engage is by saying, oh look, I'm going to design a game, can you just go through it with me? Because in talking, you're gathering the information, they're receiving the information as well as giving it to you, and so as well as being a game that you could play, in creating it, it's an empathy thing.
Yes.
We thought.
Yes.
Maybe.
And we spoke about the also the role of the facilitator in there. I mean, talk about the difference between a thing and a tool, where thing is something that anyone could do, play with, where tools used much more in an active way, potentially with a facilitator. And at first we were sort of trying to move away from that, but then we were thinking, well, actually, to build empathy with some groups of people is a lot more challenging than other groups, particularly if the topics are heavy or the experience has been heavy. And the role of the facilitator or a game, and both together, can sort of really help, particularly in those challenging situations where empathy might be difficult to foster.
Okay, I think we're done. Over to the next group. Thank you.
But actually, I think that some of the things that you were talking about resonates quite a lot with what was being discussed on in our group, which was to do with the idea, recognition is something that came up within the conversation, and recognition by engaging in activities that were everyday, and engaging in activities that were everyday in proximity. Because if one were engaging with activities of the everyday in proximity, one was able to, the proximity made a contribution to affect, that you could actually experience when somebody, you were close enough to experience when somebody was in need. And because of the familiarity and the everyday nature of things, it may be that you can step in to help at that moment, because you're close enough and because you recognise what it is that's being done and what it is that might need doing. And that, therefore, if we were trying to design for empathy in that way, it might be about, and in fact it could be about, designing opportunities to act with empathy. So I guess to that extent, yeah, it was apparent that in designing for empathy, we're creating opportunities to not necessarily design with empathy, but to do with empathy, to act with empathy. I think that was part of what was coming out of our exchange, and that does cover notions of proximity to be able to act with, and notions of recognition to be able to experience affect and step in. And then from those actions we touched on the idea that perhaps there was this sort of positive potential for a positive feedback, that through creating conditions that enable people to act with empathy, that might generate more empathy between people, that might then go forward to do things together, that might create conditions for people to act with empathy. I think that's where... am I making any sense?
So it's proximity and recognition.
Proximity, the everyday, the action, that there was an action, that there was making that was everyday, or there was an action that was everyday, that the everyday nature of it enabled recognition, and the proximity and the recognition enabled affect, that opened the door to be able to help. And this was something that came up. This ability to help was something that then perhaps would create some sort of more connected exchange, which I think speaks to some of this thing about not problem focused. I mean, we started our conversation that this shouldn't be, that particularly the making was not problem focused, but actually it was something of the everyday, and finding a way for people to enter into it that wasn't problem focused. And I think that the non-problem focused nature of it speaks to this idea of being able to help when it arises. The opportunity to help arises, and you can take that opportunity linked to the recognition that you recognise there was a problem that you could act to help. Please, group, contribute, because I'm doing my best here. So I know that all I've done is summarise what you've already contributed, but I tried to.
That realisation about activities, I think, is really powerful. To be able to create an activity for an opportunity for someone to act with empathy. I think it's a really powerful thing to place we've got, and particularly with design. I mean, it's sort of creating objects or sort of spaces and trying to make them do a certain thing or create a certain behaviour is quite difficult. But taking a step back and thinking about the actual activities, or creating an opportunity for someone to carry out a certain activity, is something quite tangible that we can, as designers, more easy to get our head around as a stepping stone to that broader.
We did have quite a lot of time spent on sort of semantics, sort of, but not really. It wasn't semantics. It was the distinction between collaboration and empathy, and whether one is necessary to the other, and what needs to proceed, which needs to proceed, in what order they might go. Didn't we?
Yeah, I was going to say also that we also talked a little about what blocked empathy.
Yes.
And I think as designers it's quite interesting also whether we block it. So one of the things we're talking about is
Kind of stuff about collaboration and designing for everything really interesting, because when I worked with a participatory artist, Claire Patey, who designed the Empathy Museum, I noticed that both the designs were for the person to do it on their own, to have the experience alone, to be inspired, to feel empathy. And I found that quite weird. Not in a bad way, but it was sort of like, because I wondered if it's because the artist has a vision and that you then, experience. I'm not quite sure what I'm saying exactly, but it seemed to me there were different types. If you have an experience with someone, it seems to be much deeper than if you have it on your own, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think there's definitely a connection between empathy and learning. And then when you think of things that promote empathy, it's communication, contact, activity, and these are all things that it's almost like we intervene in the space, and then we learn about the space, and then we grow. So it's sort of, I think, all the activity, contact, communication, these are all things that have to do with if learning is achieved, you have empathy. So
That's great.
We discuss a lot about the word empathy. What does it mean? And it starts with a very simple idea that we have this kind of asymmetry. If you have a symmetry between two people, and we can have like pity and guilty. You know, when you have these movies that you have a poor kid in a bad condition, and you have empathy for him, you feel guilty, you feel pity for him. And this asymmetry, and this could not be considered a kind of empathy that is really moving people to change things. So it was the start of our discussion. And our colleague said, okay, but I can have asymmetry and feel admiration and respect. So it was the starting point is what we can do and how powerful empathy could be to promote change. And we started with this discussion. In my point of view, it was really good because, and in another point we said, if we have empathy with people we don't have a kind of asymmetry. For example, in my case, I have maybe an older person and a guest, and maybe they don't want to be with this older. So this kind of asymmetry. And if we have empathy with people that are in somehow more symmetric, and we could have more mutuality or encounters, whatever. So we discuss a lot about the position and how it could be, the interaction could be framed, because we said, okay, we feel pity for someone, and in this case of the video, the lady said, okay, oh, she took off the glass and said, oh, my dear, I feel what you feel, I'm so sorry for you. And what's next? So this was the basis of our discussion. So to talk about empathy for change, or how empathy could be a channel for action. And this is the key point. And we talk about empathy for alleviation. So, now the life of this young daughter will be easier because the mom will be more comprehensive. And this alleviation. But she can change the state of having migraine. No. So what's for the empathy? And we discuss, however, that empathy could reframe in a new narrative things that can be really challenging, like if you feel empathy with someone that have terminal cancer. So our colleague said, okay, but we can reframe the way of these people will die. So how empathy is a strategy to really deal with really tough situations and really promote a new...
What's the next step between empathy and change?
We talked a lot about innovation and the role of the facilitator in design. So being able to empathize and understand to be able to affect change, because it becomes a collaborative approach at that point, because of that mom that's feeling bad about her daughter. What change is really going to happen other than her having conversations? It's kind of using design, using that collaboration to kind of come up with new strategies to solve. And we changed what we had here. We decided that it was collaborative tourism, and
Placemaking.
and placemaking, and
It's
instead of
not-
virtual reality and augmented reality, it was mixed reality.
It's like the Magic Leap example. They talk about the mixed reality, and I think tourism is more about visiting something, whereas the active participation or engagement is then relating more to placemaking.
Yeah, and we had a lot of conversation at the top about about the emotions that lead to empathy, because our challenges were very disparate and different. You know, there's virtual reality and then there's social tourism, and they're very different. We were talking about how they would work together, and so we talked a lot about like, what do you feel when you're meeting someone new, or you put the goggles on? There's stress, there's guilt, there's pity, there's fear, and then we were trying to flip it. We're like, okay, what's the positive? How can you get to that positive point where you have respect, you have admiration? It becomes more of a sensory. We talked a lot about sensory experience there. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if we landed on anything concrete, but
Well, I think what you're saying is really important, because I think that a lot of critics of the discussion of empathy, you know, following Obama's deficit, you know, how do you build empathy and how do you make sure it does anything useful? You know, because it's a bit like, you know, the argument is that it doesn't really bring about any change. It just makes you feel like you've experienced something.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite interesting. I don't know how to.
Well, in the case of the migraine, our solution was just a very simple tactic from social psychology called an interpretation intention. Like, oh, what if this happened? What am I going to do? My partner has a migraine. When that happens, name 2 or 3 things that you can do. And the fact that you visualized that and you felt also a need to do so, and you empathized, and the next time this is going to happen, you'll have something set up in your mind, and change is going to be in your behavior, probably. Right?
I'm not sure, if you want the truth, I'm not sure that, you know, because if I took the Empathy Museum to Margate and I put it on the beach and I did migrant stories, they just voted, you know, overwhelmingly valid,
Yeah.
you know, basically to leave Europe. Like, how come, does the information produce the emotion that makes you want to do something?
Excuse me, I have to say that people have been massively misinformed. So I think the information is the context and the way you actually provide that people can make an informed decision. So I think in that example, it's absolutely misinformed and disinformed.
And maybe
Or misled.
there's also another thing, because what we've done here with virtual reality is not with the information. We did the contrary. We gave people
sensory
and
experience.
that is so totally different. I mean, and there's also some sort of duality in there that also in the tourism example, it's not just so that I visited Rio and I stayed with an elderly person there, but the elderly person also had an interaction with me. So probably we can both empathize for each other.
But I think that's why it works, because there are 2 of you.
And there's
if you
respect.
take
It's a level of
narratives and
respect.
information to the beach in Margate, I can imagine it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's my
Because you're not taking a person to a
So I think
person.
we're saying the same thing in these 2.
Yeah.
And I think it also ties up with the example before, this opportunity to act. So I think it's overlapping with the same thought.
We also talked about the contextual nature of, you know, we're talking about what objects stimulate, and we just think like, if it's not something you can listen to at that point, then it is not going to be something. In another situation, they might be really interested in refugee stories, but not straight after the vote when everyone's hard on their hearts and is trying to defend a position that is really difficult to just. Sorry. Anyway.
I think, can we hear from the prison group?
Part of it was there needs to be interaction for the physical to impact on empathy, or does there? It was a little bit of a question as well. And I think in sort of I've struggled to read it. Personal interaction. So we sort of discussed around that. Does there need to be that personal interaction as well as the physical, or can the physical just do it? I think in the end we thought both could happen, and maybe on an affective level that's we discussed a bit whether did it need to be a conscious process or could it be sort of subconscious, and that you develop an empathy but you don't really realise it. And at the end, I think we said that could happen. The idea of similarity sort of came out quite a lot. And within that, it sort of, that also reflected in the physicality. So there was this idea of sort of openness and sort of an integrated space, so a space that wasn't just apart from the community. So it was similar to the community, not a different world. There was an interesting sort of point, like even more sort of listening to everyone else's, but I think that listening is a really important part of empathy, and that maybe an environment where there are places to listen, that actually sort of feels more conducive of empathetic. I don't know, sort of on reflecting about it, that actually has a lot. And again, sort of food and sharing, whereas another sort of sense, and affordances or whatever, that you could perceive those, that may be a bit more. I sort of also that counter, so anti-empathy things. I think there's probably a way you could describe the first prison in terms of something that limits empathy and actually both of the community but also as a more internally. The other one was relate to. It needs to be something you relate to, seem to think or evoke. Anything else from our group? Everyone had stories of different prisons, which were sort of always interesting to get those. No, not really. We would in other contexts, or like that's what we do. What we do is around sort of using the design process to look at practice and design and how they. But here we were. I think we're focused on the physical.
No, not that I'm
Yeah.
saying much about this, but it strikes me that in Norway, the people who manage work in prisons have to train for 2 years after their degree in sort of rehabilitative therapy, so that it's not just the space.
Yeah. There was a discussion.
The way you're treated that's useful. I had a boss used to say to me, "Coffee." And I was sick, and I knew that meant I had to go make a coffee when I was 20. If you're spoken to in a different way and listen, I think active listening is really essential.
We went through that circle at the start actually, so that was it started off sort of environment and said, well, it's not just about the environment, it's about that. But then it did come back to we said, well, what role has the environment in this? And it did come back to, no, it can have a voice in this thing. So it's okay to talk about, because like often when you talk about correctional design, it'll get cut down and go, well, it's not about that. It's about the managers, and we work there. We can deal with whatever. It was good that we came back to go, no, it has its voice as well.